Ready to begin. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining our joint ISR-CPIS seminar on the Resilient Pacific. This is our second talk of the semester, and I'm really excited about our speakers. We have two wonderful speakers from the American Museum of Natural History, Eleanor Sterling and Pua'ala Pasqua. So Eleanor is the Jaffe Chief Conservation Scientist at the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation at the American Museum of Natural History. She has interdisciplinary training in biological and social sciences and 30 years of field research and community outreach experience with direct application to biodiversity conservation in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Oceania. Pua'ala is a graduate of the University of Hawaii. I just have to mention that, and she is sitting in Hilo currently. She's a biodiversity scientist, a biocultural specialist at the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation at the American Museum of Natural History, specializing in biocultural and community-based approaches to natural resource management. So I like to keep introductions relatively brief. I do just want to quickly do some housekeeping before I can pass it over for a great talk. Just a reminder that we are recording, and we will be posting the link on CPIS's social media as well as ISR's website, so people can access this later. So just to let you know. And also, when we get to the end of the talk, when you have questions, please put them into the Q&A. So there's both the Q&A and the chat function, and we're requesting that you use the Q&A in order to get your questions sort of most seamlessly to the speakers. With that, I will pass it over to you, Pua'ala and Eleanor.
Mai ka o ili mua ana o ka la I kumukahi a hiki loa aku I kona kau hou ana ma ka mole olu o lehua. Ano ai me ke aloha nui a kako. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, McKenna, for the wonderful introduction. I'm Pua'ala, as McKenna mentioned, physically based in Hilo, Hawaii with the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation. And I'm joined today by my colleague Eleanor Sterling, who is physically based in New York, also with the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about when global sustainability goals meet local actions by sharing a case study and some of the lessons we've learned exploring multidimensional well-being in the Pacific Islands. At the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation, and really among a lot of the partners and collaborators that we work with, we really firmly believe that human and ecological systems are very much interconnected. And if we are to not only improve those systems, but to maintain them, we need a really clear understanding of social, economic, cultural, and environmental connections that occur between people and their surroundings. Along those lines, we at the CBC use what we're describing as a biocultural approach. And that's an approach that explicitly builds on local worldviews, knowledge systems, and management practices used in combination with methods to incorporate evidence from multiple sources and scales. This approach should begin with an understanding of locally grounded priorities and needs that inform community interactions with and ultimately management of natural resources. This approach should also account for the availability of existing data in a region and/or the feasibility to collect new data. The use of inclusive and participatory methods is central to a biocultural approach because it helps us to ensure that any sort of metrics or methods that we use are culturally appropriate and are monitored in a way that is respectful of people's livelihood strategies and time limitations, while also providing information that's relevant for local decision-making processes. Engaging community members to reflect on and choose things like metrics that are meaningful to them is a essential part of this process. And it also supports, community empowerment and ultimately improved environmental and social outcomes of resource management initiatives. So you may know that indicators are an important tool in natural resource management. And just to give us a quick overview of what indicators are, they're variables that help us to summarize or otherwise characterize or simplify relevant information so that we can make that information visible in decision-making processes. In the natural resource management field, indicators may represent observations and their resulting metrics that help us to monitor and communicate about the condition of something. It can help us to measure things like the state of something, for instance, the number of organisms, percent area covered. It can help us to track trends. Are things getting better or worse? And one of our colleagues in a 2019 publication from a multi-year collaboration we're about to introduce also really clearly articulated that indicators can help us to measure things like perceptions, knowledge, and practice as a result of management interventions. All of that said, it's important to explain that indicators don't always represent reality. And what we mean by that is what's measured and how it's measured is really dependent on the value system that frames the indicator development process. The value system of the people who are creating and measuring the indicators could be vastly different from the value system of the communities in which the indicator monitoring may be happening. And if we are addressing human and ecological well-being separately, it also means that the interlinkages between people and nature can be overlooked, which could result in conflicting or misguided approaches and decisions. And we'll explain a little bit more about what that could look like on the ground. And they're not always negative consequences, but I think it's important for us to be mindful of what we should be cognizant of and what we might aim to avoid in these circumstances. So I don't think I need to tell this crowd why we work in the Pacific Islands region, but today we're going to share with you some of the things that we've learned in a multi-year collaboration focused on resilience in the Pacific. We know that Pacific Island communities have vast experience with an entire suite of environmental, social, and cultural disturbances or changes over time. We also know that amidst a lot of these environmental changes combined with population growth, climate change impacts, maybe land use change, they turn out to a pretty sizable threat or obstacle perhaps that we as Pacific Island communities are going to need to respond to in the coming years, and thinking through what those adaptations look like is going to be critically important. In response to some of the things that we encounter in the Pacific, we convened a group together with partners in the Science for Nature and People Partnership, specifically a working group on assessing biocultural indicators of resilience in the Pacific. And this group brought together an interdisciplinary network of researchers, practitioners, resource managers, and policy specialists to again examine that interface between human and ecological communities, specifically via relationships among local to global metrics that center around human and environmental resilience and well-being. Through many of our discussions, and as you'll see via our products, we sought to better articulate, first, the complex connections between people and place in decision-making at different levels. Second, some guidelines for national and multilateral reporting that uses locally and culturally attuned approaches and resulting metrics. And finally, a case study of biocultural approaches that we and our partners have used across the Pacific and what some of those outcomes have looked like. Over the course of this project, we developed new metrics to fill gaps in existing frameworks, but we did so specifically drawing from Pacific values and visions of resilience and sustainable practices. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague Eleanor to elaborate a bit more on some of the things we were experiencing in our work that informed our approach and what we were able to do because of these experiences. Eleanor, over to you.
Mahalo Po'ala. So one of the things Po'ala mentioned is that there's frequently scale issues or philosophy issues in relation to how some people report on what success looks like. And as our colleagues in Fiji were moving forward with some of the work we were trying to do, they, for instance, tried to pilot some standardized metrics that people suggest that you use around the world to better understand how communities are doing in relation to food and food security. And those standardized metrics suggest that you ask questions like, in the past 12 months, were you ever hungry, but you didn't eat because there wasn't enough food? Or did you reduce the size of a child's meal because you don't have enough food? Or did children skip meals? And the problem, as you all may know, is that in Fiji and in many places in the Pacific and other places where we work, the whole idea of having food and sharing food is so fundamental to your identity that these questions were extremely offensive or rude or just completely off base from what needed to be asked. And another really important factor is that they're really emphasizing and re-emphasizing vulnerability or inability to be successful. And so what we tried to do is to think about, well, what would you measure instead? And we worked with community members to say, let's think about what resilience looks like and what you would do if you wanted to maintain resilience and not be thinking about how to stave off unhappiness or poverty or hunger, or all these terms that come from the outside. And so we worked with communities to think about things like the percentage of households in the community that report having a stable food supply throughout the year. And that food supply could be subsistence-based, it could be bought, it could be a result of exchange. It's really up to the communities to decide. And then another metric we came up with was the average length of time for which households in a community could have a stable, culturally valued food supply after a disaster, which is what a lot of the communities we work with were, those times that they were stressed really came after there was a tsunami or a cyclone or something. And we asked people quantitative questions, but also qualitative questions, like what are the ways that you ensure that no one in your community goes hungry? Again, that's a flip of the negative questions they were asking. It's about what are you doing to support resilience, and how can you continue to do that or reinforce those? How do you ensure you have access after a cyclone? Do people have knowledge about emergency food sources? Who are those people? Are they transmitting that knowledge to the next generation? And so one of the products that we determined might be useful from the work that we did with communities was to try to better work with the folks who are asked to report to international agencies, so the people who report on Sustainable Development Goals, which are United Nations effort to try to think around the world about what do we need to do to have healthy populations and good well-being. And so they have 17 different goals with lots of over 250 indicators underneath those goals, all of which countries around the world are supposed to be reporting on to these international agencies. But they often have perhaps values disconnects like the ones that we just mentioned in terms of the indicators, in terms of the kinds of questions that people focus in on to understand whether a system is healthy or a place is doing well or not so well. And so we tried to put together a guidance document for these folks that could hold together some of the challenges, some of the things that we're noticing are not meshing with some of these international metrics, and here in blue, some examples of ways that people could report on similar ideas, but from positions of strength, from positions of reinforcement. And one of the things through the whole work that we have been doing is better understanding why and how different knowledge systems come together. And we recognize there are multiple types of knowledge systems around the world and multiple types of knowledges. And in a local situation, there are multiple types of knowledges, but we do also recognize that frequently there are pretty different ways that people are using and sharing information. So on the right-hand side, we have these culturally grounded in situ knowledge systems that are producing information that can contribute to governance, livelihood, the way that people relate to their environment. And on the left-hand side, you have lots of people around the world in some of those government settings and some of the United Nations settings, for instance, that have the ability to see lots of different places around the world, and they're seeing patterns from what they're seeing at this global aggregate about politics, about markets, about climate, about biodiversity. Voila. And sometimes the people who come in with this generalized knowledge from lots of places around the world don't really understand the local context for applying potential solutions or ideas, or even asking questions. And by asking the wrong questions or by applying the wrong solutions, the misfitting solutions, because they don't understand the local issues, the local context, they can in fact sometimes damage the local system. Voila. And so ideally what we have been thinking about is to better understand how can you work across multiple knowledge systems that reinforce each other. And we've been calling this a biocultural process that basically understands the cultural and biological context for what's going on at the local scale. And then being able to know that well enough to then understand what can be helpful in terms of weaving those knowledges into the generalized knowledge that comes by looking across the globe, and then learning from those generalized situations that could improve actions at the local level. And just a quick vignette, I guess, that for me brought home all these issues. I was working with a number of people and colleagues in French Polynesia, and we had people thinking about, well, what would you report on from the local perspective if you wanted to talk about what a healthy system looks like? What's a good life for people who live in French Polynesia? And we had French Polynesian anthropologists, scientists, resource managers, community members, and we had French researchers and a few people from the United States. And so we ended up, because of a language issue, dividing them into 2 different rooms to answer that question: what is the good life, and what are the ways that you can report on that? What are the indicators that you might use to report on that? And I was floating back and forth between the 2 rooms, and I was fascinated by the fact that in the room that had predominantly French-speaking people, they were doing this incredible job of taking very complex information and putting it in boxes, and then hierarchically measure, just making the tiniest things, then aggregate into something else, aggregate into something else. And it was all very ordered and very thoughtful. And then I went into the room with the Tahitians, and they had the most amazing, connected, complex way of depicting what was going on. And it was this, everything was related to everything else. And so when they reported back to each other, the Haitians watched the French-speaking individuals do this structured thing, and they said, well, wait a second, that thing in the big box is actually related to the thing in the lower right-hand box. How can you possibly box them? They're related to each other. And the Tahitians then presented everything's related to everything else, and this beautiful, amazing graphics that were all around the room, all connected up. And the French were like, but how do you measure that? And so I saw some challenges, I think, that we face in terms of worldviews, in terms of what is evidence. And our vision was to try to better understand and listen to each other deeply, to understand what sources of evidence people have, and to modify this so that we can do a better job of explaining and understanding what the contexts are for developing indicators and reporting on indicators, and thinking about what a good life looks like, what success is, and then what do you invest in to support that. Next, Paula. So ideally, in the end, you have learning that takes place and enriches the different levels and ideas. Next. So that was just one set of examples of the products that have come out of these collaborations that we've been having. We have a suite of other types of products that basically scale from scientific studies to the guidance documents I mentioned that are for people who are in the national situation having to report to outside entities. And then also, we say the local community work, and trying to help people to not trying to listen to people and have cross-community sharing. So we're going to talk a little bit about a couple of those. These are the examples of the scientific papers that we've been able to publish that really try to lay out, well, so what is a biocultural approach? What does it mean? And how does it relate to indicators? And why would you care about having this culturally grounded approach that really understands the connections between people and place, as well as the feedbacks amongst those? How would you do that, and why would you do that? So there are a couple papers that enter into detail on that. And then we also are really trying to push the envelope perhaps with some of the international agencies and helping them to think through what does, say, localizing the Sustainable Development Goals look like, and what are the synergies and differences between the visions of what well-being looks like, say, across the Pacific versus what's being used in these standardized United Nations systems such as the Sustainable Development Goals. And so for this, we built quite a bit on work that was led by our group that Po'ala mentioned at the very beginning, across multiple places and spaces, but Rachel Dax at the University of Hawaii was able to pull this all together into this amazing publication. I think there's a few people on this call who are also co-authors on this work, where what we tried to do was, in order to be able to understand what's going on in the Pacific, we worked with people who work with communities across the Pacific, as well as with community members themselves, to try to say, well, what is the good life in the Pacific? How do you share and care? And that's that workshop I was mentioning in with Tahitian individuals was part of this process, where we visited lots and lots of different places across the Pacific, and people shared what their stories, indicators, evidence was about what the good life is, what is a healthy place and space. And then we worked with a number of people to group those in a way that would allow us to be able to then compare what these individuals and groups thought was well-being in the Pacific with what the international groupings are measuring. So this is an example, sorry, just the previous one, let me quickly say that we were able to group it into 8 different categories that obviously are overlapping, but more or less dealt with human health, education, environmental state, connectedness to people, as well as connectedness to people and place, infrastructure of finance, sustainability management, natural and cultural resources, and indigenous and local knowledge. Next. And then we tried to compare that to these 17 sustainable development goals that came out of the United Nations. That was a result of this intense process of looking across multiple places around the world to say, how should we try to standardize the way that we understand how things are going around the world for sustainability. Next. There are about 250 of these goals, and what we did was we sorted them, and for every single 217 indicators and 250 plus 17 goals, 250 plus indicators. And what we try to do is, for each indicator, ask ourselves, would this indicator that's being promoted by the Sustainable Development Goals actually measure something that's important to what people were saying was important to well-being in the Pacific? And this beautiful diagram helps us to see that the lines that are thicker have more connections, and the circles basically represent more indicators that could measure what's important for people in the Pacific. So what it's telling us is that the Sustainable Development Goals have a number of indicators that will help us to better understand things in the Pacific that are important to people in relation to human health, that are in relation to finance and infrastructure, but that there's almost nothing that relates to indigenous knowledge or to connections between people and people in place. So there's a big disconnect there, even though those connections between people and people in place was a really critical set of variables that people in the Pacific said were fundamental to their well-being. Next. Is this you or me?
Yeah, so I can take it from here. I think one thing that I'll add to what Eleanor presented is that, for me personally, I recognize that peer review papers are an important tool in many settings. But perhaps the most important takeaway for me with those papers and publications that Eleanor shared is that some of those papers have 30 plus people as co-authors, many of whom are community members, some are local chiefs, some work for multilateral international funding organizations that help to determine the environmental priorities, funding priorities, I should say, in the Pacific. And in bringing that group together to work on some of these products, we recognize some pretty clear gaps and pathways for action. So in addition to the peer-reviewed publications, we also came up with a series of guidance documents, which Eleanor alluded to earlier. These are online and available for downloading at the hyperlink you see here, which I am also happy to drop in the chat box at the end of this presentation. And really, these are a series of modules, we're calling them, that help to lay out the process of how you might go about implementing locally or culturally attuned metrics when asked to do so. And the module content ranges from very introductory documents, what is an indicator, what have others used, all the way through to some really detailed prompts for decision makers who are actively engaging in these processes and being asked to turn around information rather quickly on this topic. Next slide. In addition to that online module set, I'd also like to mention that the CBC, together with our network of global partners, identified a need for an online directory of tools and resources on the topic of nature culture indicators and also knowledge systems. So the CBC helps to curate this directory at the hyperlink you see here. Again, I'll drop that in the chat after the talk. And really, it's a collection of reports, articles, gray literature on the topic that has been developed by people around the world. And it's one of the ways that we've been able to share highlights from work of our partners elsewhere and encourage people to share and compare examples of what may or may not be working in their areas. Finally, I'd like to point out that the CBC, together with partners in the Center for Indigenous Alternatives and Development, my logo is getting blocked out, based in Canada, recently dropped a policy brief on measuring biocultural diversity. And this policy brief stems from conversations at the UN Convention on Biological Diversity's first North American dialogue on biocultural diversity. I know it's quite a long title for that meeting, but that gathering was convened again under this UN umbrella, but it brought together a lot of collaborators from Indigenous and local communities in North America to talk about the topic of biocultural diversity, specifically what is it that matters to people on the ground, and how might we be able to create a space for those things in these UN type global level conversations. Finally, I'd like to bring it back to that multi-year Pacific-based collaboration to talk a little bit more about how we've been able to support regional actors and processes through our discussions, through our exchanges, and through our products. Specifically, we found that regional and national leverage points are obviously really key to ensure continued linkages between this global scale work and activities on the ground. Consequently, we have had the opportunity to work with regional bodies who are setting sustainable development standards that are to be used across the entire Pacific. And examples of those organizations include the UN Small Island Developing States Unit, the Secretariat of the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, specifically their Pacific Resilience Task Force. One of our collaborators also has a strong connection to the Palau government as they go through their marine sanctuary planning. And we also had a strong connection to the Pacific Islands Forum leadership meeting that was originally scheduled for August in Vanuatu, but has since been postponed. But maintaining those communication channels and again, pathways for action has been a really promising outcome of this multi-year collaborative project. We're also, as I mentioned, helping to shape global conservation planning and priorities through strategic partnerships with international organizations, like the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, also with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, who's in the process of looking to rethink their organizational structure so that it can better link and acknowledge nature and culture. We're also involved in a number of international global assessment efforts, like that of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or ITBES, if you folks may have heard that acronym. And that's a setting where international experts are asked to draw on their work and their professional experiences to strengthen the evidence base for the state of biodiversity and what can be better done to conserve it. Finally, one of the major components of the CBC's work is convening and connecting communities around the world to really fill a lot of these gaps that we've been encountering through this multi-year project and through our related efforts. In particular, we've organized a series of gatherings for Indigenous peoples and local communities to really get to the heart of it and develop specific measurable indicators and case studies that help to highlight the important characteristics of healthy communities in a really diverse but place-oriented, place-tailored, locally and culturally attuned way. With that, I think I'm going to conclude our presentation today by acknowledging all of the individuals and organizations who have made this work possible. And I'd like to leave our contact information here as I open us up for our discussion portion of today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Puala and Eleanor. That was really interesting. I'll remind everybody to put your questions into the Q&A, not into the chat. So Puala is going to be putting some resources and links into the chat, but we'll do the questions in the Q&A. So please start adding them there. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, I'll kick us off. So I'm really interested in this idea of localizing the UN SDGs. And as I'm sure you know, Hawaii has an effort to do so through the Aloha Plus Challenge. And that work has also sort of expanded into the Pacific and thinking about islands more broadly. And I'm wondering if you can just sort of comment on that effort in relationship to the work you do, and what does it really mean to sort of localize it and make that global local connection. I know, you know, I guess what I'm interested in there is to what extent it's one thing to take the global framework and to think about how it works for people in place and space, right? But then how do you actually get back up into the other direction?
Eleanor, I might let you kick us off as I drop these links in the chat.
Sure. So I'm going to talk, I'll let talk more about the Aloha Plus Challenge, but in terms of how do you, so our vision isn't to take what the international folks do and modify it or indigenize it or anything like that. I think the more important thing to do is to understand what's important in a place in a space and articulate that well, and then see where that meshes with or doesn't mesh with the international recommendations. You don't have to report on what the international SDGs, you know, those are suggested indicators. And it's easy if you don't know much about indicators or just starting this up to sort of bring them in and just try to find data and report back. But our recommendation is to take, the best thing is to actually figure out what's important to you, how you would share with your neighbor or another country nearby what's important, and then figure out how to then report that to the international areas. And our vision is that as more and more people report on what's important to them, the Sustainable Development Goal folks might learn that they're missing whole strategies and areas that are fundamental, the connections between people, and you know, someone you can turn to in a time of need is as fundamental as having money in a lot of places. And so I think by countries reporting over and over on things and the international folks seeing those things being reported, that can make some space for what's really critically important to folks on the ground. But in terms of the Aloha Plus, do you want to respond on that?
I don't think I would add very much to the process that you've laid out, because you've characterized it really well. To the Aloha Plus Challenge specifically, I think one really interesting thing to point out is that as a local 2030 island hub, Celeste and others have really pioneered a voluntary local review that they'll be presenting to the UN later this year. For a lot of the UN member states, so at the country level, they are required to do voluntary, and they're not required because it's called voluntary, but national reviews to characterize their progress in achieving the SDGs. Whereas the Aloha Plus Challenge team and collaborators have used this opportunity to be able to characterize local progress toward achieving things like the SDGs, but in a way that makes sense for us here at home. So while they're quite connected, there's also been some flexibility that I've seen in things like the 30 by 30 commitments, trying to tailor an overarching SDG focus, perhaps, goal to better speak to what communities here at home are asking for.
Thank you. We've had a couple of questions come in through the Q&A. I'm not sure everyone sees the Q&A, so I'm just going to read them out loud. But I think you can both see the Q&A as well. What were some of the biggest obstacles in facilitating dialogue between local and global stakeholders, and how did you overcome them? Thank you for the great talk.
I can take a crack at that one. It's interesting. Of course, pre-pandemic, we had a lot more opportunities to gather in person, which we know that for many Indigenous and local communities, face-to-face communication is very much the preferred method of communication. That said, these are global partners that are required to fly pretty far distances to get to these global meetings. And so that challenge, I guess one interesting challenge that I've encountered in this work is that, as you might imagine, when you bring Indigenous peoples to an urban center like New York City to attend a UN meeting where there are board meeting offices that are perhaps not our preferred discussion spaces, or there is terminology that may or may not resonate with our understanding of our place. And that's even before you start to think about the considerations of incorporating multiple languages in that space. That was quite eye-opening for me, and thinking through how many of our global collaborators who have dedicated their lives to being involved in these conversations are able to manage those different lenses as they proceed with their work. But in terms of these, let's talk about non-UN gatherings where we engage a lot of different partners in a discussion space. I think, as Eleanor alluded to earlier, really getting to the level of conversation where you're asking people to describe what it is that they care about. It really changes the conversation, takes a little bit of the bureaucracy out of it, if at all possible, by getting to the core of what it is that we see as these connections and what we hope to ensure is around for future generations.
That's great, and I agree with everything Paula said. I think I might also note that one of the biggest challenges I alluded to is that what is evidence is fundamentally different. And so many people in the international arena are caught up in this this mindset that you have to have standardized data, and what you get from Bangladesh has to be the same thing you're getting from Ethiopia, has to be the same thing you're getting from Fiji. And we keep trying to challenge that. Like, why? What do you want to know? You want to know how things are going. What difference does it make if, I mean, $1.75 a day doesn't mean the same thing in one place as it does in another. Just because you have something standardized doesn't actually mean that it's meaningfully standardized. So we keep trying to push back on that and show that there are different ways of gathering evidence, there are different ways of sharing information, and that you can still do what you want to do, which is to say, how are things going and what can we do to strengthen the good things and eliminate the obstacles without necessarily using some easily measured statistics or variables. And so the nature of evidence and what is evidence and how do you share that evidence has been challenging. And And we've really overcome that, I think, by just listening and learning and creating spaces where people can appreciate each other. And as Paula says, I mean, it's actually kind of important for people who want to engage in the indigenous people who want to engage at the UN level. It's important for them to go there and see what those spaces are like and understand why people are coming with these weird metrics when they show up in their backyard. There's a reason for it. There's something about this consensus and all these other things and the political process that sort of drives things the way that they're driven. And there is a utility to that as well. But it's good for everybody to kind of know why another group is sharing what they're sharing. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Moving to another question, how best can local nonprofits be engaged in the ground up work and also use this research/data/process to influence and change systems causing harm?
I can start and then I'll open it up for Eleanor's additions. I think it really depends on what your local nonprofit might be doing. But I'll also say that in my experience, getting your hands in the soil, so to say, is an equalizing factor. And so if you are a local nonprofit that does community-based conservation work or restoration, really things that are out on the land, I think that you can be engaged in this process by keeping your head down and doing the amazing things that it is you're doing for local communities as an example, really, of what it looks like to live these things in action. One example from here at home that I'll call out is that last year, 2 rural communities were nominated and eventually awarded Equator Initiative prizes, specifically Mo'omomi on Molokai and Ha'ena Kauai. And they, part of that process is that some of their community members are flown to New York to be acknowledged as recipients, and they join a network of many other local communities from around the world whose nonprofit efforts are showcased on a global stage. And so, as I said, really just keeping up the good work, for lack of a better phrase. I think that's an excellent way for nonprofits to be engaged in the process by, again, being that example of what things look like on the ground. Go ahead, Eleanor.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also in terms of how can they overcome some of the harm, I actually think that doing more work, or as much if not more work, across linking up with other organizations that are doing similar work or doing complementary work, so that you can create a bigger space and a bigger voice for what is happening, and that can start to counter some of these dominant narratives out there. And I do think that collaboration and learning from other NGOs and other not-for-profits, and trying to better see how what you're doing fits into an ecosystem of groups working together can really strengthen the possibility of changing the system.
I'm going to skip to a question that seems complementary, and we'll go back to Alex's question. What are some of the features of a Pacific framework that you employ to marry the local and global?
So I'm happy to jump in here. That mess in the middle, we called it, where we were trying to understand what evidence is for different systems. You know, one of the things we try to do is we look at what are some commonalities. We all eat, we all care about food, and we have different ways of caring about food. If you can find some areas where there is where there's a coming together about importance of things that are critical, and then through that, then work out from why is this slightly different here, or why is this slightly different there, and then really think that through. That's one of the things we try to do. But also, what we really try to do in terms of marrying was actually take a step out and really high up, and just say, well, what are they trying to measure by asking what $1.75, $1.90 a day means to somebody to bring someone out of poverty? What are they trying to measure? Is that really about money, or is it about having the knowledge to be able to access resources in your environment, to be able to eat healthily and care for your family and live in a situation where you're free from concern over a storm coming through or something like that? So we tried to take a step out from the very specific global and local indicators and try to say, well, how can we come up with bigger picture domains that essentially underneath you could have very specific indicators that are meaningful in different places around the world, but they aggregate to something that is of importance to people at across all of these places.
Yeah, I have a similar answer, and I'm kind of struggling. I have a slightly different perspective on the terminology marrying local to global, and I know you may not be tied to that, the person who presented this question, but yes, they are different, and yes, there are synergies. Um, my questions are more around why are we marrying them, for what purpose? But I think that if you go back to that, we affectionately call it the spaghetti diagram, where we looked at the interconnections across the SDGs and the Pacific wellbeing elements with the lines. You may recall that infrastructure was a really big one that resonated across the SDGs, but also in the Pacific. And if you think about that sort of thing, again, trying to bring it back to a local context, like what we sometimes see here at home, if the priority is infrastructure, you may be able to secure resources for things like bridges, or we know home here, we really need help with our harbors. Harbor infrastructure is something that a lot of communities are struggling with because there's no money to either build or maintain these facilities. So it's not that those things aren't important on the ground, but if the priority is infrastructure and not the things that Eleanor's talking about, like why do we need the bridge? In Kauai, the bridges flood out all the time. So what is the larger issue there that's causing the need for the bridge? So if it gets locked in at the infrastructure level and neglects things like land use change, increasing severity of episodic weather events, then we're really just putting a Band-Aid on rather than trying to look at what it is that's happening on the ground that is driving the need for new infrastructure. So again, that's not really marrying necessarily, but I think it's trying to come at these different priorities from different angles to better understand where are these places of intersection and how might we be able to study these systems more or work with our policy folks a bit more to come up with more systems focused solutions.
Do you have any advice for students, undergraduate or graduate, who are working to understand how to connect their academic studies to transformative action?
I can speak from my experience with this, but I have been out of the university circle for a little bit, so I might defer to Eleanor on what it currently looks like in her area. For me, it has been extremely useful as I was going through my studies to seek out internship opportunities with managers and decision makers who are actively given the responsibility of caring for our local places, because while it's important to research these spaces, to me, it's equally important to understand the factors that go into decision making. I was able to do that. I think the most informative experiences for me were working across sectors. So with private sector, private landowners, but also being exposed to state decision-making processes. There are a fair amount of fellowships with federal agencies here in Hawaii and on the continent, for example, in DC, that give you a really great glimpse into what is the saying, how the sausage is made, what goes into these larger decision-making processes. So I think during your academic studies, seeking out those opportunities can be really important. And especially for local students, a lot of times these need to be paid opportunities because of our circumstances. And I want to let you know that they are many times. So those things exist, and please do look into them.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I continually tell myself what I always said is one of the most fundamental things is to understand that you can learn so much in the classroom that actually, and you can be really, really good at the classroom stuff. And then when you get to action, you find that what you learn in the classroom isn't necessarily helpful. I mean, I remember when I was taking conservation biology as a graduate student, we must have spent 6 weeks on whether you should set aside one single or several small reserves to conserve something. I mean, we spent an enormous amount of time having these fights over this, and the real answer, once you get to the on the ground, is it depends. And trying to basically take a step back and take a systems approach and understanding why and how things are happening, as Paolo was saying. Like, we all get focused in on being a good engineer, but maybe you don't need an engineer to solve a problem. Maybe you need somebody to work on human-wildlife conflict or human-human conflict. And so taking a step back and trying to understand the system and figuring out where those leverage points are for the transformative change is one of the most important things that students can do. So be good at what you're learning in school, but also be good at taking a step back and being a systems thinker. And there are a suite of characteristics that contribute to your being a systems thinker that can help you to better understand what does transformative change look like. And I think the most important thing you need to remember is just because you can do it, or just because you can measure it, doesn't necessarily make that thing the most important thing to do or the most important thing to measure and talk about. You really need to understand what drives the system, and even if it's hard or complex or tricky or supposedly immeasurable, that might be the thing that you need to focus in on.
How would you differentiate research method and methodological approach? And maybe if Robert can elaborate a little bit more on that. We'll go to the next question, and Robert, if you want to elaborate a little bit more, we can come back to that. How do you take into account an unwillingness to change? There seems to be a disconnect between community priorities and management capabilities, but it often feels like there's an unwillingness for management approaches to adapt, change, and stick to the status quo. While you recognize there is a value disconnect for international organizations and local systems, is there a willingness from management entities to adapt and change approaches to better acknowledge and accommodate these differing value systems and worldviews?
I can try and start us off as before and then open to Eleanor. And let me clarify that I'm specifically speaking here from my own experience, and it could very much differ for others. But in the things that I've been exposed to, I think this is where the policy tools come into place, and things like constituent engagement. As I mentioned, we did papers through that multi-year collaborative, but we also did policy briefs and these guidance modules for decision makers. And it's being able to adapt your outputs like that in a way that it can speak to the audiences that you are trying to impact. In addition, I've also seen firsthand the critical importance of having a high-level policy champion. So yes, it matters to talk to diverse members of an organization, but if you really want to see something change, you got to talk to the right person. And that comes up in things like customer service, but also in natural resource management, finding the person at the right level that shares enough synergies with what you're trying to advance so that they do have appropriate access to the right systems, the right people to make that change. Eleanor, what would you add to that?
Well, that was pretty good. I mean, I think that when we face unwillingness to change, better understanding why are they unwilling to change. Is it because they're already stressed and they're being forced from a different level to do a suite of things that they actually can't? Trying to understand why somebody is doing something that you feel is counterproductive, not demonizing them and saying, oh, they're lazy or they don't care or things like that, but just entering into their space and understanding why they're doing what they're doing. Then you can better understand the source of the unwillingness. And I have actually found that there's a huge amount of willingness on the part of people in, for instance, the Sustainable Development Goal arena to think about localization. What does that look like? What does it mean? And providing examples of other people who've done it is one of the most powerful things that you can do. And sharing with somebody in a position thinking that they can't make change and showing them where that change is being made. There's some amazing examples out there from Aotearoa, from New Zealand, where they are making massive, major change, systemic change at the national level about what what they're measuring in order to talk about health of the environment, for instance, using an understanding and collaborating with Maori with knowledge, and having people see that and recognize that it's out there, it's happening, can really be an inspiration for people who have been unwilling in the past. There will always be unwilling people out there, but you try to work with the people who are willing and make those examples, those models that can inspire others.
So I think this will be our last question. We're heading up to the hour. This has been a really rich discussion. Thank you. The last question is, how has your work intersected with local context, specific human development index measurements of people and their capabilities, long and healthy life, health and knowledge, education, and a decent standard of living? How can we best understand across different local contexts meanings of decent standard of living? It's difficult to imagine a global measurement leading to more socially just and sustainable forms of development. Mahalo.
So same structure, I'll get us started. But I think that things like human development indices are important tools, but through some of our work and the things that I've seen, I think we need to remember that they're not end all be all guides for us. And what I mean by that is, as with any sort of index data source, really, you need to parse apart that data. Where did it come from? Who collected it? Why did they collect it? What is your representative sample? Who makes up that sample? If, for instance, you're doing phone surveys, but you're actually concerned about a community who may or may not be have a high level of response in phone surveys, then perhaps that index is not characterizing the population that you thought you were looking to better understand. In terms of trying to think through a decent standard of living, I think going back to our presentation, for us, it really came back to the core of asking people to describe what a good life looks like to them. If these indices are using metrics of health that are purely focused on physical health, things like non-communicable diseases or perhaps mental health, but are missing things like the importance of cultural identity, the importance of strong social networks, then really the index is characterizing, again, the user community in a way that may or may not be consistent with the on-the-ground experience in that area, if that makes sense. Yeah, let me tap out and go to Eleanor.
Well, that was great. I think the only other thing I might say is that our vision is that it would be impossible to come up with one global measurement that leads to more socially just and sustainable forms of development, and that we think that well-being is multidimensional. And that's really what I just said, and that you need to find ways to share these multidimensional aggregations to then look across multiple indicators to be able to then say, this is going well, or here's where we need to invest more effort or ideas or energy. So we're very much proponents of something that we call multidimensional well-being, which isn't just human well-being, but human well-being in relation to the environment and the space in which those humans live.
And I think one thing I just was reminded of bringing up in terms of the social justice and equality piece, if you go to our guidance modules, specifically module D, which is that most in-depth module, as I mentioned, that one is designed as a series of prompts for decision makers to use. And it has a lot of questions that ask you to parse apart existing data sets, existing indices, if you will, to check that you are taking account for social harm. Are you considering potential impacts to a cultural system? Are you designing the index in a way that is cognizant of local time limitations? So I'd really direct you to that module for an example of prompts you could ask yourself to try and better, so that we all can try to better wrap our brains around what a strong example of development that is informed by social justice and equity, I should say, could look like.
Great. Well, I really want to thank both of you for just such an awesome and engaging talk, and that was a great Q&A. Thank you all for the questions that came in. I want to just quickly announce that next week our talk will be by Professor Rebecca Stotzer. She's with the Manoa School of Social Work, and she'll be talking about cultural connections among people from the Micronesian region as protective factors. And also that Tara's talk from last week, as I said, is posted and available. So if you missed it, you can still see it. And we'll have this talk posted and available soon as well. With that end of housekeeping things, are there any last words, Pu'ala or Eleanor?
Not from my end. Thank you all for the opportunity to share.
Yeah, thanks for the great questions. I like thinking about things from different perspectives, so it's great. Mahalo.
All right, mahalo everybody. Have a good rest of your Wednesday and see you next week. Thank you.